Welcome, everyone, to the third NCoC Learning Circle of 2022. I'm Matt Leininger. I'm Head of Democracy Innovation at NCoC. Today, we're going to be talking about civic language, and we're supporting the launch of the PACE Civic Language Perceptions Project. We actually have 524 people registered for today's Learning Circle from 43 states. We will not, rest assured, be asking you all to introduce yourselves, but thank you all for joining. We're recording today, and feel free to ask questions in the chat whenever you want as we go. We're going to obviously try to get to as many as we can, and PACE will also be adding those questions to an FAQ page that they're going to be putting on their website, so all of that will be there as well. NCoC is the National Conference on Citizenship. It is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization chartered by Congress in 1953. We convene the field of democracy and citizenship at events like these learning circles at our annual conference in the fall. We also measure progress in advancing civic health through tools like our Civic Health Index, civic infrastructure scans, and engagement scorecard. We are incubators of supporters of cutting-edge civic initiatives such as Pandemic to Prosperity, Party at the Mailbox, New Public, the Algorithmic Transparency Institute, and their Civic Listening Corps, and things like that. We define citizens as people who are contributing to civic health and democracy. NCoC does not include immigration status as part of our definition. Our work and our congressional charter centers us on active citizenship and strengthening civic life in all American communities for all the people who live in them. PACE, you're going to hear more about PACE in a minute, but PACE briefly is Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement. It is a philanthropic laboratory for funders seeking to maximize their impact on democracy and civic life in America. PACE and NCoC work together to support the field through collaborations that take on some of the key intellectual and practical problems that we all face. Civic language is definitely a key intellectual and practical problem. And actually, since 2019, and two different phases of research that you're going to hear about today, PACE has been playing this vital role in helping us understand the problem, explore the problem, figure out what ways we can work together on it. They've been doing that for both the philanthropic community and also many communities of practice. Civic language is important because the people trying to strengthen democracy in America are this massive, diverse, diffuse network. They're all over the place doing all kinds of things. There's people doing service and volunteerism, voting, dialogue and deliberation, civic tech, public journalism, racial equity, participatory budgeting, bridge building, placemaking, all kinds of institutions, organizations, and grassroots groups. And their work kind of represents the fact that there's no single answer to the problems of democracy. There's a whole bunch of answers, of good answers, and they need to be combined together better. The terms that we use are often getting in the way of that combining. They are terms that just aren't compelling to regular people. They aren't clear. People are fighting over what they mean. And as you'll see also in the research, many of these terms are increasingly politicized. They're associated more with one party or another, or one end of the political spectrum or another. So this civic language problem is wrapped up in our polarization problem that we're facing in America today. It doesn't mean that all these terms should be abandoned. I mean, some maybe should be, but many should be clarified, and many of them should be injected, with new passion and new meaning. I wrote an article on this civic language challenge 7 or 8 years ago, and I wrote that the field is experiencing a harmful identity crisis. While we may all agree that our work relates somehow to democracy, we have not established or articulated a common vision of what that really means. This lack of clarity has dire consequences, producing rifts between people who actually have many of the same goals. Worst of all, the lack of clarity about democracy provides no help to people who are trying to create sustainable participatory political systems in places like Egypt, Thailand, the Ukraine, and many other countries. When I look back at that article the other day, I was surprised to see the reference to Ukraine. 7 or 8 years ago when I wrote it, I was writing about the Euromaidan protests, which brought democracy to Ukraine and laid the groundwork for a lot of what is now happening, the conflict that is happening there. But the challenge I was writing about then is still the same for them and for us today. whether people are trying to defend democracy, literally, or trying to make democracy work better. We need to be able to understand each other. We need to be able to work together. We need to be able to negotiate, develop better practices, and get things done better. And for all that, civic language is critical. So we're going to hear more about the research that PACE has done and the project overall from several people. One is Kristen Campbell, who is the CEO of PACE and a true leader in the field. Also her colleague, Amy McIsaac, who is Managing Director for Learning and Experimentation at PACE. Mindy Finn is joining us. She's the CEO of Citizen Data, which is an organization that empowers groups with audiences, research, analytics, and insights to build bridges and unite Americans. And then we're going to have some commentary on the research from Dr. Jonathan Collins, who is a friend of NCoC. He's an assistant professor of education, poli-sci, and international and public affairs at Brown University, where he also holds research affiliations with the Annenberg Institute for School Reform and the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy. Much of his research centers on school systems, local governments, other institutions, and grassroots leaders who are trying to work together to make decisions and solve problems. And of course, how people use language can be a hindrance and also a help in that work. So if you have to hop off at 3, no worries. NCoC and PACE will be sending you first NCoC will send you the recording, the slides, and other resources, and PACE will send you another follow-up email for everyone who registered with more resources and more ways you can get involved. If you can stay on between 3 and 3:30, we've added a coffee and donuts half hour for more questions and comments. Unfortunately, we will not be providing coffee and donuts. We will be pasting an image of coffee and donuts in the chat. That is about all we can do. Someday, some future form of Zoom will have an instant food button, but for now we have to make do. And so now that I've let everyone down, Kristen, maybe you can take it away.
Thanks, Matt. I love the coffee and donuts metaphor. It's much better than the rush the speakers at the stage after the conclusion metaphor. Thank you so much, Matt, and the entire NCoC team. You are wonderful friends and colleagues to me, and appreciate the support of my old stomping ground. I worked at NCoC for 6 years, and so appreciate the support of my old stomping ground in helping us launch or release this project today. I am going to share my screen, and while I do, I want to acknowledge and appreciate my colleague Amy, who was mentioned, as well as our colleague Julian Santos, who you will see chiming in the chat, who are really my partners on this project alongside another colleague, Zach Morin. I know that we also have many members of our board and our membership on the call today, so thank you all for joining. For those who are not familiar with PACE, we are a network of foundations and funders that invest in civics and democracy broadly defined in many of the categories, Matt, that you just described. Our members are very diverse in a lot of ways. There are foundations and funders that are national, local, place-based, family, community, intermediary funders. Some tackle civic engagement and democracy head on. Some think about that as a strategy to address other issues that they care about. So super diverse in lots of ways, but we do share a belief that animates our involvement in PACE. And that belief that's shared among our members is that America will be more healthy, productive, resilient, and successful if democracy is strong, and if the office of citizen is treated as central to how democracy functions. So we really believe that American democracy will thrive when all of its people are informed and engaged in the process of creating it. We, in order to fulfill this mission and this work, we bring our members together to learn from each other, to find opportunities for collaboration and experimentation, and to hopefully do that in ways that model what positive and productive and vibrant civic space can look like. So as we have been bringing our members together over the last few years, there was, really this common theme that was emerging in a lot of conversations, which is our members were really struggling with how do we talk about our work? And that's always been a challenge in some ways. Matt alluded to this, like that's always been a challenge in some ways, because a lot of the words and phrases, which that's what we mean by civic language, the words and phrases that we often use in civic engagement and democracy work, they can often feel very academic. They can feel very elitist, very conceptual. They can feel like big ideas. And most people don't wake up in the morning saying, I strive to be a civically engaged participant in my community today, and I will contribute to the social cohesion that is necessary in a self-governing society. Right? Like maybe me, I wake up and say that, but probably nobody else. So there's always been that kind of challenge of the language of how we talk about this work feeling academic and a little disconnected from how maybe the people that we seek to inspire might talk about or think about this work. But we were also hearing from members that there was a new challenge emerging, or a more urgent challenge emerging, around how a lot of these words and phrases were becoming coded, loaded, and politicized in ways that they hadn't necessarily been before, or were reaching a new fever pitch in ways that they hadn't experienced before. And we really started wondering, like, what do we do about this? At best, does this mean that we're just talking past each other? And at worst, does it mean that we're actually furthering some of the divisions that we think we're trying to solve for, or furthering feelings of disillusionment or disengagement? And so we took on this project originally in 2019 because we recognized the need to understand when we say these words and phrases, what do they mean to people? If anything, what do they mean to people? And the questions and the urgency around that line of inquiry have grown since then. So we did a very limited look at this project back in 2019. You can find the archive of it on our website. But today and now, what we really wanted to do is we wanted to deepen and broaden and expand our inquiry in ways that would allow us to disaggregate our understanding in a few ways, and hopefully eventually move to identifying what are some things that resonate, what are some pro-democracy messages and rhetoric that we can consider that might be cross-cutting in the ways that we intend it. So the inquiry that really overarches this whole process is, we assume that there's a disconnect between how those of us who get paid to do this work talk about it and how people that we seek to engage and inspire talk about it and think about it. And so our inquiry is really trying to understand this disconnect. PACE's job to do in this inquiry is to advance this with funders, but we understand and believe that there are many organizations grappling with this. That's why 524 people registered for today, that this is a shared challenge. And so while we will be working to advance this inquiry in philanthropy, we wanted to share and facilitate our process in ways that others could glean from it and apply it to the work that they're doing in the contexts and in the communities that matter to them. So we see diving into this inquiry as a three-phase approach, each with its own specific learning question. And I want to say something really clearly here, because we saw when we reviewed, in case you ever wonder when you register for an event and you put in what you want to hear about, in case you ever wonder if we actually look at them, we look at them. And one of the things that I noticed in reviewing the registrations today is that a lot of people said, I want to hear recommendations of what language I should use. And I want to hear the findings. And I hate to burst your bubble, but today is not about the findings and it is not about recommendations. I urge you to please resist the urge to see anything that we present today as a definitive finding or as a recommendation. It's data. And data is a way that we listen, but it's not the only way that we listen. Data is the input that's going to help us dive into larger streams of inquiry that then hopefully will result in some recommendations, but we really don't want to get there too quickly. Data can only tell us so much. And we really need to spend some time making meaning of that, disaggregating it, and interrogating it further. So these are the three phases. Today, we're phase one. We will be doing some qualitative analysis in the phase 2, or we really try to dig in a little bit more and say, okay, what's behind this data? What does it mean? What color and nuance can we bring to it? And then we will culminate in a reflection and recommendation phase. What do we do about the disconnect? Why do we do anything about it? And with whom? Knowing that the recommendations will be very different for different communities and in different contexts. So phase 1, the guiding question of this phase is, what disconnects exist between how the professionalized space uses these words and phrases and how the rest of the world does? The way that we tried to get to this question was through a nationally representative survey, was fielded in late November 2021 to 5,000 registered voters. It is a nationally representative sample. We also, in partnership with 5 of our members, they sponsored 7 oversamples to take looks at specific communities. We are not releasing oversample data today, but I do want you to know that it's available, and it will be to come in the future. So this is the survey that we are releasing today. And these are the words that we tested in the survey. We chose these words because they are usually not literal actions like voting or volunteering. They're largely conceptual values and ideals, and they mean a lot of things to a lot of people. Almost by definition, these terms are open for interpretation. They're not necessarily literal and direct at all times. And that's part of what makes communicating about them, particularly to diverse audiences, particularly challenging. And so I do want to say from the outset that all of these terms matter, and they are very important and very salient for people. This project is not designed to assess whether people's acceptions or associations with these words are right or wrong, whether they are good or bad. That is not the objective of this. The objective of this is to just take some time to understand. And for those of us for whom advancing these ideals is important, for us to consider what is resonating and what is not with the people that we are trying to inspire. So this project is not about creating no words. It's not about asking anyone to change their language or to silence anyone, but it is about helping us consider ways to effectively advance more pro-democracy, pro-liberal democracy values in service of a more perfect union for more people that is more inclusive. So for each of those 21 terms, we asked 3 things. We asked, how do you feel about the terms? Who do you associate those terms with? And how do you feel about those people? And that is our way to try to help get at not only what of the challenges about communicating about this work are about messages, but which ones are also about messengers? And to what degree can we disentangle that challenge? We, by virtue of having a 5,000 person sample set this time, we have a number of crosstabs available that we think just really add to the richness of our understanding. We have crosstabs available on demographics and location. You'll see all those listed here. We're going to run through a couple of them in a minute. We also asked about different experiences and attitudes. We asked if people had a civics education class. We asked who they voted for president in 2020. We asked where they got their news and what types of activities they think are important to ensure that democracy works. So again, just ways to try to help us tell a more nuanced story about how people might come to these perceptions and associations. So here's what we're releasing today. We're releasing 5 things: the data, which you'll get a drive through a dashboard that we designed for non-statistician audiences like me. We tried to Kristen proof the dashboard. If Kristen can use it, hopefully most other people can too. So we're making that publicly available today. We also have an infographic for every word that we pulled on. We do have some early findings, again, some and early being the operative words there, but we are going to share with you some of what we feel like we're seeing coming out of a high-level look at the data. Because we have the cuts available, we're going to do some deep dive sessions looking at different angles: race, gender, politics, civic education, religion. What are the different angles that we can take into understanding communities associations? And because there are 16,000 pages of data, which is a literal number, citizen data. I thought that they were being hyperbolic when they told us that. And they were like, no, really. 16,000 pages of data. We both can't analyze it all on our own, and we shouldn't be analyzing it on our own. We want to democratize the analysis process and open it up to more people and bring more perspectives and experiences into the analysis process. So we're launching a mini grants program to give a little bit of resources to incentivize further exploration and analysis and interpretation of the data. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen so that my colleague Amy can, and she's going to give us a spin through the dashboard and the infographics, and then we'll go to Mindy.
Great, thank you so much, Kristen. And let me pull up my screen here. As I do, I want to introduce myself. I am Amy McIsaac, the Managing Director of Learning and Experimentation at PACE. I am very excited to be launching this data, and I have the really fun job in this presentation of walking you through the dashboard itself. This is how we have organized the data, and give you a quick demo of how to navigate to the questions that you may have about civic language in the dashboard itself. Julian, if you haven't already, go ahead and put in the link, pacefunders.org/language. This is the front door to this project. This is kind of the main page for this project. And the first thing that you'll see on that page is a way to access this dashboard. You can access it right now. It is live and ready to be engaged with. When you click on that link to access the dashboard, it takes you to a very quick form that will ask for some information, and then in your inbox is all the login credentials. Just want to give people a sense of that process. But what I am showing you and what you should be able to see on your screen right now is what happens when you log on and how do you arrive? This is what you'll see. This is the Civic Language Perceptions Project dashboard. You are immediately greeted by some highlights. I'm calling these our greatest hits in the data. Kristen alluded to the fact that there is 16,000 pages of data. There is a lot to dig into. And what Citizen Data, our polling partner, helped us do was pick out some of the most kind of frequently asked questions about the data. And you can see those tabs there. I'm not going to go into each of them individually, but just the view we're looking at right now lists very simply the 10 most positive rated terms and the 10 most negative rated terms. Obviously, there's a lot of story and nuance behind those, but that's kind of a quick glance, and we'll get into kind of how to see those storylines in a moment. I also want to draw people's attention to the user guide. This is a real walkthrough from a narrative perspective of how to use this dashboard. There is also a frequently asked questions document link in here. So as people are asking us questions about the dashboard, we're putting them in a document in case others have that question. So that's a good resource for you. There's also a video tutorial, which is a version of what I'm doing with you right now. I did about a couple weeks ago. We recorded it, and that is there if you ever need a refresher of which buttons to press to get what kind of information. And if you're still having issues after you've read this and looked at the tutorial and the frequently asked questions, you can email us at language@pacefunders.org, and we'll be able to help you troubleshoot anything you need as well. So let's get into the data itself. And at the top navigation bar, what you see are three options: top line, two-way crosstab, three-way crosstab. These are kind of increasing levels of complexity to look at the data. So let's just look at the most simple version first. I go to top line. And what you see here on the left side is a few fields that I can specify what I specifically want to see. Really quickly, as Kristen alluded to, we had a lot of questions in the survey that you can sort by. So experiences and impressions. Maybe I want to see how someone voted for a presidential candidate in 2020, if they have a civic education background, what news source they rely on. There's a lot of options there. We can look at folks' demographics, let me get to the demographic part: age range, gender, political ideology, region, religion, lots of options there. Sentiment towards groups. How do people feel about conservatives? How do people feel about different demographic groups? Of course, this is the language perceptions project. So all of the 21 words and their perceptions of terms are listed here. You can pick a particular word of interest. And the same with association. How are folks associating different terms that we pulled? So all of that is there. So just to show you, for example, if I wanted to see how people are perceiving the word democracy, what comes up, Martha, I saw in the chat. Can you see the questions? This is where you'll see the questions that were in the survey itself on this first tab. This is actually what respondents saw. You'll see then a bar chart. And we see here that 60.9% of all survey respondents had a positive perception of the word democracy. 7.7% had a negative, and you can see the other versions there as well. And then top line, this is where the raw data lives. If you are a statistician and want to see percentages, frequencies, this is where you get that. And I want to also let folks know you can download this, of course, in any version that's helpful to you. So that's kind of the most simple version of the data to look at if you want to look at the highest level. Where we imagine a lot of folks will spend time is in this two-way crosstab. So this allows you to put two variables in relationship to each other to understand something deeper about the storyline. So again, a lot of all the fields that I just showed you are still available to you. And let's say we want to stay on our track of looking at the perception of the term democracy, but this time I want to also see it based on race. So again, the data is loading in. You can see the two survey questions that I'm putting in relationship to each other. I can see that as a bar chart. I can see that as a stacked bar chart. And again, all of my data is here for me to pull if that's the way I want to engage with this. One thing I will name is that you are able to mute some of these if you'd like. So let's say I wanted to see of all the people that had a positive perception of the word democracy, this is the racial breakdown. And let's say I just wanted to see everything that was non-white. I can do that as well. So that's a helpful tool, I think, to look at. Also, very importantly, you can reverse the relationship of the variables to each other by reversing the axis in the chart. So if I click here and I say, yes, I want to reverse that. Before I was looking at race, democracy by race, now I'm looking at race by democracy. And so what this is telling me, and if I just look at the top, of everybody who identified as white and Hispanic in the survey, 57.5% of them had a positive perception of the word democracy. So again, it's just which version of the data is interesting to you. I just wanted you to see that both are possible. Lastly, the three-way crosstab. So this is the most complex version of the data you can get into. So again, if I wanted to see perceptions of the term democracy, and I wanted to look at that by race, but I also wanted to look at that by how somebody voted for a candidate in 2020, a presidential candidate, I can press submit. And as the data is loading in, you'll see these are the three survey questions in relationship, and this is the raw data to look at. Because it's a three-way crosstab, it would have to be a 3D visual for us to have a visual representation in here. So for the three-way crosstab, we just have the data available, but I think that is going to be helpful for many of you as well. So quickly, what I wanted to also share is, as Kristen said, we did have a chance to look through what you all submitted in your registration form. So I thought maybe as a helpful way to, again, show the power of this dashboard, I would just pull out two from folks and run how I would approach answering that. So someone had said they want to learn more about how civic infrastructure is perceived as a term. So a lot of different ways to approach this. One way I might do it is going back to this top line and looking at just perceptions of the term and selecting civic infrastructure. I'm a visual person, so I'd probably look at the bar chart and I can see the breakdown right there. And if I wanted to do something like, I want to see the perceptions of the word civic infrastructure, but I'm also really interested in seeing it by age group. Let's say I'm interested in seeing how do young people think about the word civic infrastructure? I can come to this two-way crosstab and start to see that storyline as well emerge for me. Another one I pull out was someone wrote, I would love to learn about how clergy should think about using civic language. It's a great question, and not to scoop where Kristen's going to go later in this presentation, but we'll have a whole deep dive on the religion look at this data. So that would be probably a good session for whoever submitted this to attend. But how should clergy think about using civic language? That's a big question. It would depend on what the clergy member was interested in achieving and doing and getting out of it. Maybe one way I would approach this would be to, again, come to this two-way crosstab and probably go to the demographics and pick a religion. And then let's say I specifically was interested in some terminology. Let's say I was interested in activism. So this is telling me of everyone who had a positive perception of the word activism, this is the religious breakdown of those folks. And if I was particularly interested in a specific religious group, let's say Protestant, I could say of everyone who filled out the survey and said they were Protestant, this is how they feel about the word activism. So that might help you get to some understanding of how clergy might think about civic language. You can kind of think about the different words of interest. One thing I want to alert folks to is because there was so much information that was captured in this data, we obviously built this to be a language perceptions project tool, but there are ways you can engage this data have nothing to do with language. For example, if I wanted to go to top line and I just wanted to see, I'm curious where people are getting their news these days. I can see that. That has nothing to do with language, but that is an interesting thing and an interesting way to be using the dashboard. If I wanted to see how people are using or where people are getting their news source from and what that meant for how they voted in 2020 for a presidential candidate, I can do that in a crossway tab, two-way cross tab. There we go. So I just wanted folks to know that this tool, like we said, we built this for one particular learning inquiry, but it's powerful. It's a powerful tool, and we wanted folks to know that you can use it in a lot of different directions. The last thing I want to show is another way that we're trying to make the data accessible, and that's through infographics. So if you go to that pacefunders.org/language, again, that kind of main landing page for this project, there's another link that will get you to infographics. We're going to be doing batch drops of infographics over the next couple of months. And what we have here to release today is 21 infographics, one infographic for every word that we pulled. And what we have at a high level, and I'll pull up the first one, activism, so you can see, is a visualization of the favorability breakdown of this word at a high level, the 5 groups most associated with this term, as well as the racial, age, religious, and income group that gave it the highest positive rating. So this is just to give you a sense word by word of the overall storyline, and then really invite you to dig into the dashboard to get more of the cuts that are of interest for you. I want to make sure folks knew that was available. So with that, like we said, there is a lot more to dig into here. We are moving into a space where we will be doing much more digging in, exploring, and analyzing the data over the next couple of months. But the PACE team and our tremendous partner, Citizen Data, who helped us on the polling of all this, we've been in the data for a couple weeks and months now, and we have started to see some things that we thought would be helpful to start a conversation as a field. So I want to invite Mindy Finn, the CEO of Citizen Data, to share some of what they have started to see in their own takeaways. So over to you, Mindy.
Mindy, I think
Mindy, you're muted.
you must be muted.
First time today. Somebody had to do it. Thanks for
That's
ripping
right.
the Band-Aid on that one, Mindy.
Am I good now? Am I
There
good
you
now?
go.
Great. Oh, you're echoing.
Yeah, I get it. Try again. Got to shut off the computer.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, and no echo. Go for it. But now she can't hear us.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Can you hear us? Yes.
Okay. I was on phone audio, but apparently that was not working. I just did it to make sure in case there weren't internet issues. So apologize. I'm going to dive in. So thank you so much. I'm going to go right into the data to make the best use of the time. Share screen. Great. So some of this you just saw with Amy on the dashboard. So I will breeze through. What I'm going to walk through are really just some key snapshots of some different ways to look at these words and some interesting insights that we've gleaned thus far as we go through the data. Obviously, there is so much more to discuss, and I hope that many of you will stay around in Q&A or coffee and donuts so that we can talk through it. So to underscore in terms of the, this is always the drum roll, please. Of course, you saw a preview. with the dashboard, the terms that were rated most positively across the board in general for all respondents were unity, liberty, citizen, followed by justice, democracy, and diversity. The terms that were rated most negatively across the board, across demographics, were privilege, social justice, and racial equity, followed by activism, justice, and patriotism. I saw already in the chat, because I couldn't help myself by seeing all the questions and comments that people were putting in there. There are some terms that are on both lists. So we're on the top 10 lists of most positive terms and the top 10 lists of most negative terms. How is that? What it means, and we'll kind of get into this with the demographics, is sometimes there are certain segments, usually of subgroups of individuals who may have a more negative reaction to that term, even if across the board on aggregate, a term is viewed very positively, and a term like democracy is a good example. So civic engagement. So here's something, obviously this is a term that many people in the field, many people on this call, including PACE obviously themselves, use quite a bit. So drilling down a little bit, I'd say double clicking on that term, about 2 in 5, 40% had a positive impression. Those slightly more had neither a positive or negative impression of the term. This is one of those terms that many respondents, so 42%, it was neutral. They didn't have a positive or negative opinion of the term. It rated fairly high in terms of those who said they were not likely to be familiar with the term as well. And I will note, as Kristen said, we both measured, obviously, respondents' views on these terms, their feelings towards these terms, as well as their feelings towards different groups, subgroups in society, political groups, socioeconomic groups, racial groups, and then who they associated with the term. So even though it was quantitative, what that helps us get a sense of initially is why might they be having a negative associated relation with the term? Is it because they associate it with a certain group? I will say on civic engagement, respondents were most likely to associate it with liberals and progressives and college graduates. The term democracy, so nearly 2/3 had a positive impression of democracy versus only 8% who had a negative impression. Democracy as a term was most associated with several types of groups, nearly half associated with liberals and progressives, that was 47%. And that's more than who associated with conservatives, though 41% associated with conservatives. And while it was equally associated with working class Americans, it's middle class Americans, much less so with upper class Americans. Patriotism. So patriotism was a term that was ranked very highly, 54%, only negatively by 11%. It was overwhelmingly associated with white conservative Americans, and much less so with liberals and progressives, more with working class, by 10 percentage points than upper class Americans. And finally, I just want to point out, and Amy kind of got to this, in addition to terms, there were a number of other indicators that we looked at that we thought would make interesting crosstabs to try to start to get to the why. The qualitative will get more to the why, but to start to get to the why of what might be driving these various differences in viewpoints around these terms. One was media habits, and we're still diving into this, but I thought the group would be interested in knowing that among media sources, the media source that most cited turning to for news about politics and public affairs in a typical week was local television news, followed by those who said social media sites or applications. So getting into some of the demographic differences, there are distinct differences across these terms. I will note that I'm not going to have a graph on it, but pretty much really across the board, men were more likely to rate these terms positively than women. When it comes to age, we see that those who are older, 65 plus, were more likely to rate almost all the terms more positively than those who are younger. And in fact, the younger you are, the less positive you were likely to be really on most of the terms. So the term patriotism, I'll just use as an example, it was viewed positively by nearly 77% of those over the age of 65, and yet viewed positively by less than half of the youngest age cohort, 18 to 34. On the other hand, just conversely, those 18 to 34 were most likely to rate the term activism as positive, while those 65 plus were the least likely to do so. So that is really an exception to the rule. The term activism is viewed very positively by the youngest cohort, and those who are oldest were the least likely to rate it positively. Going into education, with the positively viewed terms with the largest gap, what we see here is the more education a respondent has, the more likely they were to see these terms as positive. So we're starting to see a trend here. The men, those over 65, and those with the highest levels of education were the most likely to have a positive perception of these terms. Civic engagement, while still a net positive term, is seen here to have the largest gap between those with a high school degree or less and those with a graduate degree at a 39-point difference. Going into race, we see here that most of these terms I mentioned before are likely to be viewed more positively by white Americans versus other race and ethnicity groups. Hispanic Americans or Latino Americans and Asian Americans generally kind of go together in terms of how they're rating these terms. We see a little bit of differential on civic engagement and a few terms, but they map much more closely, whereas Black Americans were likely to be the least positive across most of these terms. Across the 6 most positively ranked terms with the largest disparity between subgroups, the largest gap is found between white and Black Americans. And finally, and Amy had pulled up a religion example on the dashboard as well, and there's so much more to dive into as well. But I took just a snapshot here of the term democracy. And you see some interesting insights when you look at it this way. You see that Hindu Americans and Muslim Americans view the term most positively across all religious groups. Those who are atheist or agnostic rate it very, very positively as well. We could start to probably draw some conclusions for why we're seeing that. Of course, those who are Protestant rank it high as well. Those who are Catholic and evangelicals, but Muslim Americans, Hindu Americans, and those who say they're agnostic or atheist are most likely to rate democracy, the term democracy, positively, which I thought was quite interesting. Finally, just quickly diving into civic education. I know a lot of folks on this call look to civic education as such an important part of civic engagement. This is something we looked at. So just some things off the bat, 68% of respondents reported having taken civic education. So whether they did it or not, 68% reported it among the 5,000 respondents. That's nearly 3,500 that said they took a civic or American government class in high school. 53%, we asked about 2 different definitions of democracy. And one of them was democracy is a system or structure of government of, by, and for the people. 53% of those with a civic education said that was the definition versus those without. We also asked about civic engagement and what it means. Is it participating in our democracy as voting, as well as activities, or just community activities, or both? 58%. So as those who define civic engagement as both government and political involvement, or government/political involvement, and voluntary charitable activities, 58% defined it as both who had civic education versus 44% without. I'll also note that the term civility, which is one of those terms that I have the stat here, I think it was 68% of those who had a civics education that ranked the term civility most highly versus 40-something% that do not. And 30%, and when it came to voting, across all political or charitable activities, voting was the activity that was chosen the most associated with participating in a democracy. Those who had civics education were 30% more likely to said they voted in November of 2020 than those who didn't. 65% of those with civic education said that they voted in 2020. And then we can just see here a snapshot of some of these terms. Yeah, there's the stat I'm looking for. So on civility, this is the most drastic difference. 63% of those with a civic education see it as positive, compared to only 37% without a civic education. So if you had a civic education, you were almost close to 2 times more likely to say that you have a positive feeling about the term civility than those that did not. Other terms for which there are significant differences with civically educated, see them more positively, include bridge builder, democracy, and common ground. Turn it back over to the team.
Thank you so much, Mindy. And I told everybody beforehand I was not going to look at the chat because sometimes it distracts me, and I've been looking at the chat. And I can't help but notice some of the comments that are very good ones. And one of the things that this data doesn't tell us, which is, are people rating the perceptions of the words based on what they feel we have or what they feel we can aspire to? And that is a level of nuance that this data does not tell us, and part of what we hope to get into in additional phases. And there's so much too that is about interpretation around the terms. I am going to try, I seem to have lost it. I'm going to try to pull back up my screen for a second. Oh, that's why. Okay, bear with me. Okay, so how do I start playing this again? Okay, so that's what we're releasing today. As Mindy gave, and I'm going to go through this real quickly because I know we're running short on the time before we go to coffee and donut hour, but I just want to share one observation that our team is having as we're digging into the data as well. We had an assumption coming into this, an informed assumption based on what we were hearing from folks, that a lot of these words would code liberal. And I also noticed in the registration that a lot of you were wondering about political perceptions based on this. The data does largely bear that out. However, there is, as always, more of a storyline behind that. Conservatives rated half of the terms with over 50% positivity. So they are still largely positive on a lot of these words. They're just not at the same level as liberals necessarily. Liberals rated 16 of the 21 terms 50% or over. When we look at low positivity words like privilege, very and somewhat conservative, we're actually more positive towards the idea or towards the term and concept of privilege than very and somewhat liberal. And also some of the things that I think we expected, we assumed that there might have been more political disagreement around, there actually weren't. When we look at something like unity, that was the most positive term overall, it was also very positive in both conservative and liberal responses, which maybe is a signal, maybe it's a signal of the fact that some of us that are very steeped in the political dynamics associated with some of these things might assume that things are more coded than they actually are for many people. Now, this also does come down to what could also be a fundamentally different interpretation of what some of these means. We have privilege because we live in the United States is a very different statement and sentiment than white male privilege exists. So knowing exactly what people were referring to or experiencing associated with these words is something that, again, the data doesn't fully give us. And while it's an important insight and a spark to open a conversation, perhaps, that's why we don't want to take it at whole cloth and rush to assumptions or recommendations around what it means. So this is the type of nuance that we hope to be able to get into in some of the deep dives. So speaking of, these are the 5 deep dive conversations that we have scheduled. You can register on the website when you get access to the website. Thank you to those for your patience. To those who haven't been able to access the site yet, I don't think our website has probably ever gotten this much traffic. So it might just take a minute to let its coffee kick in for the day. But you can register, you can see details and register for all of these on our website. We are also recruiting promotional partners for these sessions. So if that's something that you're interested in, please feel free to reach out. And as I mentioned, we are doing the mini grant program, $500 for folks to jump in, tell us what question you want to answer with the data and how you want to answer it. And we plan to give about 40 mini grants of $500 each. We will accept applications until all the money's gone. So, jump in and let us know. We are going to review on a rolling basis so that we don't, we don't spend all of our money on day one. We want to be equitable and like spreading it out a little bit. So there will be a rolling process for review, but please consider taking advantage of that. The next things ahead, more infographics. Amy mentioned we're dropping them in batches and we'll drop them in conjunction with the deep dives. We are taking on some focus groups. We're also going to do some mini papers. We're not going to release a whole report around this. We just don't think that that's the best way to engage with it. We are going to release some mini chapters on things like what might media consumption habits tell us about how perceptions and associations are formed. What signals might we have about words being open for branding, things like that. Again, not a full report, but kind of mini snapshots. So you can expect those from us over the next couple of months. And we hope to recap a lot of what we've done in this learning process in the fall of 2022. With that, I will share appreciation for Amy and Mindy and turn it back to Matt and nervously await my grade from the professor.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And please, all of us, please give us a round of applause for our presenters here. You can do that by putting your little hand on this, the symbol on the screen. That allows me to just keep talking while you're doing that. Jonathan Collins, could you give us just a few minutes of reactions to this? I mean, this is so much here. It's an enormous volume of information. The dashboard, you're just scratching the surface here of what we could how we can explore this. There's the 60,000 pages underneath that. This is all national kind of randomized data, but I imagine you with your research, you can see some things that are probably resonate as far as the work that you've been doing at the local level with school systems, local governments. I'm wondering if you have some thoughts for us.
Absolutely. First, Matt, thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to be in conversation about the data release. I found the dashboard, like I'm sure all of us did, to be quite maybe overwhelming, but in a good way.
Yeah.
In a good way. It's like drinking water from a fire hydrant. So still trying to kind of process everything that's happening here. I mean, first, I want to start by saying that I want to give, you all and Pace credit for putting together something that is, I feel like, stepping into new frontier in some ways. I know, Public Agenda and Kettering have been doing similar data collection projects over the past couple of decades now, but this idea of keying in on the framing of terminology feels extremely cutting edge and getting at a particularly precise dilemma that I think we're facing right now with American democracy. When you do this kind of work and you look at kind of nationally representative surveys that try to assess how people are thinking about institutions, I think one of the biggest criticisms that arise during the sort of scholarly conversations is, well, what do people think that we mean when we ask these kinds of questions? And you're getting at actually measuring differences in how people view these specific terminologies that feed into these questions. And it kind of makes us jump back and ask ourselves, well, what have we been measuring over the past couple of decades? When we're measuring people's perceptions of democracy and people's affinity for democracy, what are we measuring here? When we insert and sort of swap around some of these terms for one another as if they're interchangeable, what you're showing here is that there's quite a lot of variation in how people are thinking about these terms and coming to understand them. And I think that's extremely valuable. What this data release also kind of makes me think about are kind of two pathways. So, the one pathway is, well, I'll call it playing defense. And so you're showing us that there's evidence emerging that there are these distinct differences in perceptions of these kind of emerging terms that are cutting across different groups. So like across demographics, we're seeing different responses to different kinds of terminology. This suggests that, well, there are political and civic actors that are actively working to co-opt these terms. Like why are there differences in how people perceive democracy versus social justice? Is this, on one hand, is this a linguistic problem? I doubt it. Like, this is a political problem, right? This is a civic problem. And so this suggests that there are political and civic actors that are actively working to sort of co-opt these terms. And that could be good or bad, depending on the intentions of the group. And so, we have groups that have been working to utilize these terms in ways that are generative and educative. So using terms as ways to kind of spread information, to improve the overall sort of political knowledge level of the public, making people more aware of certain or specific political issues and specific political problems. But then there's also groups that have been using these in more exploitative ways, and in ways that look to benefit from the use of misinformation to create a guise over some of the sort of civic and political realities. And so, like, you're showing us that this co-optation is happening, and it raises the question of kind of like, well, what do we do about that? And so, I think one important question is to figure out how to frame democratic initiatives in ways that cut across these demographic groups. You give us something you give us sort of a jelly bean trail to this with showing us the specific terms that seem to be most popular across groups. And it raises this question of like how we can mobilize, whether it's cutting across groups or mobilizing within the margins. And so I think this is more of the sort of playing defense. Here are these terms that are being co-opted, and what can we do to sort of diffuse the power of this co-optation?
Right.
The other pathway is playing offense. And so, what are the terms that seem to be immune to co-optation, and why? Democracy in particular is this term that for some reason seems to be persevering past a lot of the attacks. We've had this consistent attempt to delegitimize an election. And I was very concerned as to like how perceptions of democracy would look in the aftermath of such an event. And the fact that there still seems to be this strong support for democracy as a term, I find to be very, very reassuring.
Yeah.
And so, but what makes democracy so immune? Is it because there was sort of a rallying of flag effect from these events that actually created a newfound appreciation? Or is there something else happening sort of cognitively that creates this sort of immunity? But I think it's important to figure out what seems to inoculate these the most popular terms from this sort of co-optation, because then that invites us to think about, well, what are the strategies that we can employ to protect other terminologies that could be victims of co-optation, right? So think about like how in the democratic innovation space, we use terms like participatory and deliberative. And so what are the future of these terms that we have been using, that we are building initiatives that cut across groups and cut across space and are actually trying to bring people together? How can we ensure that these kind of terminologies aren't co-opted and used in ways that are destructive? But I'll end there. I'm pretty sure I'm probably over my time. And I loved everything happening here.
No, that's true. I love that kind of framework that you just gave us about playing defense, playing offense. I mean, that sort of thing is incredibly useful as we kind of absorbing this enormous amount of data and trying to move toward this question of like, well, what the heck do we do about this? And that's a great frame for kind of beginning to think about, and it's got me thinking about things that one could do under each of those categories. So thank you, that was terrific. I'm going to wrap up the formal part of this, because I know some of us are going to stick around for coffee and donuts, but I'm going to wrap up the formal part of this now. I want to thank my colleagues who helped to make this happen. Angela Holden, Jamie Engel, John Kilcoyne, Cameron Blossom, who were helpful in all kinds of ways to make this happen. Also our friends at PACE for bringing this amazing project to us and to the world. It's very exciting, and we're looking forward to being part of it. We particularly value the fact that you, Kristen, and colleagues, you're doing this in a democratic sort of way. You're inviting people to make meaning of all this data, giving them tools to do so, mini grants. We also have, as hopefully you all find out about in the future, we have plans for a civic language challenge that would get people proposing new language or new messages or tools or various kinds of things that would kind of use some of the kind of approaches, general approaches that Jonathan just gave us to help people figure out what to do about civic language. I want to tell you all that we do have a next learning circle on April 13th. It's called Legislators and the Public, Lessons from 80 Parliaments Around the World. It's going to be a very interesting discussion based on a new report that's come out about how our legislators around the world working with their constituents in new ways. And Maya Kornberg, who led that research project, will be part of the work. Also a member of Parliament from New Zealand, and the head of the engagement work for the Irish Parliament will be joining us. So it'll be a very interesting international conversation. We'll be able to kind of tease out what lessons we might bring from that to the US. So please keep your eye on that. It'll be April 13th at the same time. Thank you all. We're going to come to the questions that we can get to in a minute, but please be assured we will indeed be sending you the recording, slides, other resources automatically to everyone who registered for this call. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Did I see Doug Dobson's hand up?
I think you did.
I did, but I think it went away.
Oh, and we have, just so you're all, fully appreciative of this, we have Coffee and Donut image in the chat. So, so we can now transition to that part. And let me see here. We have some questions, and it got very confusing because there are about 100 different questions asked in the chat, and a whole bunch of them have already been answered. Doug,
I would appreciate Mindy for jumping in on some of the methodology questions.
Yes.
I'm trying to tick those off as we go.
Awesome. Scott Palmer, I don't know if he's still with us or not, but he asked the question, how and by whom were the surveyed terms selected? Assuming future surveys are planned, is there a way to suggest additional terms?
So how the terms were selected? They were selected in process with advisors and partners and members about really based on the frequency with which they were used and just how much they were coming up in our work. We had, as you might imagine, I think at one point the list was 90 terms long. We had to make some really tough choices because otherwise people will not complete your survey and they will throw the computer against the wall. So we had to make some tough choices about which terms would use. Some of them are ones that we preserved from the 2019 project. Some of them are new ones since then because we were able to expand. And some of them were ones that we just felt like there was so much discourse around right now that we'd be remiss not to have them. So there's tons, there's many, many, many more terms that we could ask. Happy to share our survey instrument with anyone if you would like to run a similar survey using other terminology. You would certainly be welcome to do that. And if we are able to do additional surveys like this in the future, would be happy to consider additional terms to add to that as well.
I think I was on the group that was the advisory group that was offering terms. I think I added about 47 until Kristen told me to stop. So we had a lot to work with.
There is a lot, and there's a lot that are so close to each other too, right? Like we did end up going with civic engagement instead of civic participation because they felt, while I'm sure there would be some interesting things to learn about testing both of those and the nuances between them, it felt really hard to choose both of them. That said, we did have both common ground and common good because we felt like those were used in distinct enough ways, even though sometimes people use them interchangeably. So we have that pairing. We did end up with that pairing, and we did end up also with justice and social justice because we think that that is an interesting pairing to compare and contrast to each other, and that those words do still come up a lot.
And Scott Palmer is still with us. That was his question. And he just added in the chat, I would love to use your methods to also study rule of law. Thank you. So I'm going to keep reading some questions, but if people want to add to their question, if I say your name as I'm reading your question, if you want to give more context to it, please just put your hand up on the thing and that will bump your image to the top of the screen and I'll be able to see you. Do not consider one subgroup of the other. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. It took me a second to remember what AAPI meant.
Yeah. Mindy, can you actually jump in on this one? I know that we gave people more granular ways to self-identify, but we did need to aggregate some subgroups, some groups together in order to have statistically significant things to compare against. Can you speak to that a little bit, Mindy?
Yeah, absolutely. And that about covers it. In a standard, like even at Citizen, our standard surveys, we like to use census categories just because if it's standardized, it does allow us to compare different data sets together to be able to have apples to apples, as imperfect as it might be. But in this case, and when we can, especially with such a large sample, we like to give even more extensive options and give people the ability to choose more than one option, like white and Hispanic, for example, because increasingly that is becoming really important. And those subgroups are large enough, in a survey this large, we still have a statistically significant group that say selects white and Hispanic. But we did roll some of them up again, just for the purposes of, like, even in the dashboard, being able to look at them as a group, and also based on what tends to be standard in census, while recognizing that even every attempt is never perfect. I'm seeing from one of my colleagues that we had 265 select as Asian and 29 Pacific Islander, which at 29, it's really not a statistically significant subgroup on its own. 265 is, and combined it certainly is.
Laura, you're unmuted.
Yes, yeah, I wanted to let Mindy speak to that. So I submitted that question. I don't know if I can be really succinct with this, but I see a lot in approaches to these kind of projects where it seems like there isn't really an understanding of the difference between racialization versus race, which is, people are aggregated as a monolithic category for convenience. Whereas if you understood racialization as different pillars, like, colorism, xenophobia, then you might have a better understanding of why there are certain similarities you can see between Asian and Latina populations, because we have a commonality of experience under xenophobia. Pacific Islander may have more commonalities with the indigenous experience. So, when you are aggregating something like AAPI, that's kind of what you're missing. And I think the census does actually make a distinction between Asian, American Indian, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander. So I think you would really, it would be a disservice not to look into that. And I liked that earlier there was a flag about asking if people had civics education. Many minoritized people I have heard from have noted that US history is often taught cutting off before World War II, which erases how imperial politics have positioned different bodies of culture in America today. And so I'm curious about how you might be thinking more systemically about civic engagement, because I often see a lot of initiatives that are applying band-aids through language instead of tackling the roots of civic disconnection.
Yeah.
For instance, looking at ethnic studies, why not fund that directly?
When I think there were kind of maybe a somewhat similar thought from the chat. There was a comment about African Americans' ratings of words like justice and liberty, and the person in the chat said, my sense is that low positive ratings of the terms are connected to feelings of less access to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very fair point. And I think that's part of why we wanted to be able to have this type of classification is to understand, okay, when we do break down into certain groups, and the point is well taken that there are lots of ways to disaggregate, and no community is a monolith, and there's no way to, you know, fully accurately represent all of the nuances that people experience within certain communities. So that point is super well taken, but that is part of why we wanted to do this as well, is to understand, like, it's not just about saying, well, you should be supportive of democracy because that's the system we have. Like, when we're able to get under it and say, okay, well, Black Americans have this perception, where does that come from? What experiences might they have had or not had that could lead to greater understanding about why that perception and sentiment exists? I did just want to pull up, this is one of the things that you can see on the dashboard through the top line, is you can see how many respondents in the survey self-identified as different things. So we did have more racial identity classifications, including Native American and Alaska Native and Pacific Islander and Asian. Like, there's lots of different ways that people could self-identify. And then in some ways they were rolled up into larger categories for the purpose that Mindy noted, but that is certainly not intended to minimize any of the real nuances that exist within certain communities, but we did lean on self-identification for demographics.
I know we have other questions, but just to add to that, a couple quick things. We did disaggregate in the dashboard Pacific Islander and Asian, so you can go and view that. Just noting again, the Pacific Islander sample is very small. You know, even with a 5,000 sample, which is really large for a survey like this, it still has limitations. And so some of these other questions, looking at potential racialization or being able to dig even deeper on some other subgroups, you can't do. But you still, you know, there's other tools for doing that. There's oversamples among specific racial groups. There's qualitative, of course. And then the final thing I would just say is that all the data we shared today was based on two-way crosstabs, but in the dashboard, it certainly won't do everything that you were getting at, but a three-way crosstab can really help start to even elicit more interesting patterns, because you can look at race by religion and term, race by region and term, and start to really disaggregate, even to Kristen's point, where certain groups that we might categorize together are certainly not monolithic, and doing the three-way crosstab helps to tease that out.
Coffee, donuts, and three-way crosstabs. We're just like, you know, we're going crazy here.
BRB, I have to rename the group chat with my team.
So Janine Walsh, I don't know if you're still with us, but you had a question, which was what definition was used for the terms middle class versus working class? Was it based on household income? That seems straightforward, but that may be not so. What?
Yeah, so I can answer that. So to be clear, we do ask, when we ask people to list demographic information, we have income categories. That is a bit different than what I was reporting out. So what I was reporting out is when we ask people to share their sentiment, positive or negative, about all kinds of types of people, we included as socioeconomic class options, upper class, middle class, and working class. And then we asked people to associate the terms, who they most associate the various terms with. We didn't give a definition in that case. We just, we recognize that some people might have slightly different definitions for what they consider middle class or upper class, but it was more just to get a sense of, because people do tend to group, have these perceptions based on groupings, to start to get even more context for why might people have a negative or positive perception of a term like patriotism or democracy or justice.
Nick Neihart, I see you actually on the screen. I don't know if you want to add to this, but your question, did you think of testing the word freedom? It wound up being in the name of the big democracy omnibus bill on the Hill, the Freedom to Vote Act.
We did think about the word freedom. It was on the short list, but unfortunately just didn't make it into the 21. That's the honest answer.
I think there had been, it was sort of interesting because people associate it with, I think, conservative views, and yet it wound up being the name of that. And I think I'm pretty sure there was testing that went into that. I know there was testing. I don't know whether how much of the reason that was, but it would, you know, I think it appealed to a lot of different kinds of people.
Mhm. Mhm.
Absolutely. So the next one, Suryani Dewa Ayu would love to know your thoughts on how this research can influence policies impacting the design of physical and virtual public spaces where policy decisions get made. In other words, like city halls. How can we design more equitable, just, welcoming civic spaces? Thanks so much for hosting this learning circle. Terrific question. That is definitely something that's on the minds of people at NCoC as well. New Public, which is one of the projects housed at NCoC, is focused on that very question. Do you want to add to that at all?
I would add that one of the things that I know.
Suryani was going to add though. She
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
No,
Oh, Esther.
Oh, you're unmuted, or you're mute.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks so much, Matt. Just wanted to say I'm coming at this with a background in training in urban design and planning. And so I often think about how these spaces have a built environment language. And from your learnings, would be so curious about, you know, what can designers and urban planners do to help create more welcoming spaces? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like that's a particular field and profession where the language, I think, gets in the way even more than some others. Kristen or Mindy or Amy, anyone else want to jump in on that, or Jonathan?
One thing that I would say, it's not to urban planning specifically, but to the question around like policy overall. There's a group called the PopVox Foundation that's run by Marcy Harris. And one of the things that they are looking at is there's been some executive orders from the president around having more community involvement and more community input into the implementation of various policies that have been designed. And one of the things that Marcy is trying, and her team are trying really hard to do, is to help philanthropy and the civil society sector be that kind of conduit in certain ways between the government and between affected communities, or communities that are most likely to be impacted by the implementation of certain policies. And so I think there's a really interesting role there, and almost like translation role, that civic organizations and funders can help play. But I would just point to Marcy's emerging work in this area as a way, because I think government is, it's really good at a lot of things. It's not necessarily good at community input, right? And that is part of what the civic sector is better at. So what could a partnership between the civic sector, who can speak the language of communities, and the civic sector, who can speak the language of government, what is the role that can be played to help make sure that the well-intended policies actually meet the needs and the desires and the hopes of their intended beneficiaries, and what role can be played in the middle there. So it's not a direct question about how this project can be helpful, but I do think that there's a lot that's interesting to interrogate about that relationship and how language plays a role in that.
I'm thinking now of the kind of the standard notices that you see for a zoning variance. The planning department posts, you know, the most boring looking piece of paper you ever saw, with the most inaccessible language about some type of change, which might in fact have a big impact on the place you live and so on. And John, I put the links to PopVox and New Public in the chat. I think the whole field of placemaking, which is basically about being extremely proactive about inviting community members from the beginning to help design their spaces, probably has a lot to share in this topic, and New Public in terms of the online side of that. Let me go to the next one, and also feel free to put your hands up if you'd like to simply kind of ask a question. I've got another one here. Walter Roberts said, this is a zooming out question. What implications are there related to collective language, voice, impact for the multitude and distributed movements supporting a democracy and civic health? A very big zooming out question. Who wants to take that one on?
I'm not sure I follow what's underneath the question.
Yeah, I don't know. Walter, are you still with us? There he is. Go for it. There you go.
Right. So what's behind the question is thinking about how, Matt, it goes to your comments that opened us an hour and 15 minutes ago about how many different nodes, organizations, fields there are that are trying to do right by democracy, how we do civic engagement, all those things. And my interest in the field is how all those things are working in harmony and together as much as possible, and where there is discord and or diffusion or confusion. So you've got all these nodes, you've got the language that each node likes to use, theories of change and all those sorts of things. So my question is to any of the presenters, of the research that you've done here and the findings so far, not findings, but the digging in, what implications do we have for how we move towards more alignment and more cooperation, more awareness of one another and the language that we use in the field of making change? So it's sort of that's the zooming out and a little bit of what's behind it.
Wendy, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So, I think part of it is in approaching this question is not wanting to get too prescriptive, because as you mentioned, everyone has their own goals, their own theories of change. And we're at the very beginning stages of assessing this data. I mean, even with the amount of analysis that we have, which is vast, there's still a lot more to do, and a qualitative phase to start to dig into some of the things that popped out of the data that didn't really answer questions, but said that there's new questions we need to be asking, such as why, is the word privilege viewed negatively? Is it because people feel they don't have privilege, or they're tired of, they don't like that term is used a lot in the public, or that they think that certain groups are more privileged than them? We don't know quite the answer to that, and we want to dig into that. All that said, I think part of what, just kind of even at the macro level, I would circle and kind of look to as if we're a field and we're saying kind of how should we be responding to this data? I think there's a couple of things. One, there's the terms that are already viewed very positively across the board. Which a way to perhaps think about that is like, these are terms that you want to be incorporating. These are currently unifying terms that are important to use. There might be reasons why we think those terms are imperfect, because they're not, maybe they're not capturing the full spirit of how the way we talk about democracy or civic engagement. So then there's a question of overusing them. But we know that they're terms that today are not as coded. They're not getting as much of a negative response. Terms like unity, for example, even a term like liberty. Then there's the terms that might be positive, but also rank up there on the negative scale too. And some people in comments pointed to that. Democracy is an example. I think I looked at some comments in the chat where I think some were feeling heartened. They were expressing that they were heartened that democracy ranked so highly. And it did, but also noted that a couple things. One, none of the terms ranked super negatively, but it's on the list of top 10 most negative rated terms. So in that way, it still is a bit polarizing. It's on the list of those that are polarizing. And also, we asked about two different definitions of democracy, and we didn't go into that in depth today. But one thing that really comes out of that is people have different definitions of democracy. So even if they're viewing it positively, different definitions. And so that's something that needs to be done. And then the third thing I would point to is there are definitely a lot of these terms that people are just not that familiar with, they're not familiar, and in many cases, it's more of a neutral container, even if they are familiar with it. And perhaps the way to think about that is, I don't think that means don't use it. I think that's this is an opportunity potentially to raise greater awareness in it with a term, and really shape one's perception and definition of a term like civic engagement, for example, which was one of those terms.
Yeah, I'd agree with all that. And I can envision a bunch of other ways that we, meaning PACE, NCoC, the field, can kind of convene and help people move along on this. And things we could be doing at our annual conference and all kinds of other things. I also think that another thing that's in the works that we've been thinking about and talking about is this some kind of civic language challenge to kind of encourage people to follow Jonathan's two different vectors here and both play defense and play offense, but to give people prizes basically for developing various kinds of messages. And the civic language challenge may itself be too limiting, because I think one of the things we have to recognize here is that words are very important and almost never enough. And that when we're talking about communicating about democracy and citizenship and all these things, we need images, we need video, infographics, cartoons, whatever it takes. And I think we want to encourage that kind of creativity among people to kind of come up with messages which are more, that are communicable and clear and really kind of carry some of these ideas better than the things that we've been using. So that's another piece that I'm excited about that I think we'll be trying to kind of unroll as part of this whole collaboration.
Mindy's alluded. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Better? Do I sound like a robot to you? Okay.
No.
I sounded like a robot to myself for a second.
Yes, you do.
It might be just that time of day. Mindy's alluded a couple of times to definitions, and we've talked about some of the definitional challenges. We didn't ask definitions for every question because we didn't want this to feel like a quiz, and we didn't want it to feel like a gotcha, like we were trying to catch people and say, yes, this is right and this is wrong. So we didn't ask definitions for a lot of questions, but we did ask definitions for 2 questions that we asked both in 2019 and in the Refresh project. And those are the ones on your screen where we said, there are lots of ways that people think about these things. Here are 3 common definitions that we often hear. Which of them most closely aligns to how you think about it? And so this is, Julian can put the link in the chat. This is on a Medium piece that we released today, but we asked, do you think about democracy as a structure of government, a form of self-governance, or a way to prioritize marginalized voices? That's the shorthand definitions. The longer ones are on there. And then we also asked which most closely aligns with how you understand civic engagement. It's a way to influence government. It's a way to help my community be better, or both. Right. And we did have an other option. And of course, a few people chose that, but just to give you a little bit of a sense of what we do know about how people were getting their heads around these things.
Here's one that I think is fairly straightforward from Richard Young. Did you all also gather geographic residency data as part of this? Do you know the geographic breakdown of respondents?
We have census region data, and we do have some data, some additional data for places that we oversampled, specifically Arizona, Massachusetts, young people in North Carolina, young people in the upper Northeast, Southwest Michigan, and then we have nationally women and Jewish people. So we do have oversamples on those groups. Those haven't been released yet. We're working with the members that sponsored those oversamples for those. So we do have a little bit more on those, but overall, I think the only geographic identifier we have is census region. Mindy, is that right?
Well, yes. So we actually, we have the raw responses and we match them to a voter file. So for most, we would know actually exact geographic location. But in terms of reporting out the data, we chose to do it by region as opposed to state, because we would not have, even with 5,000 respondents, we just wouldn't have enough for all states for it to be statistically significant by state. You can imagine Wyoming, Rhode Island, et cetera. We would for California and Florida and Texas, most likely, but not in New York, but not all states. So we're just presenting it by region, but we do have geographic identifiers.
We also have, I almost forgot, we also have, we ask people to identify what type of community they live in, whether it's urban, rural, or suburban. And so that is, I believe it's listed as community type in the dashboard.
Okay, we're running out of donuts, and we have one more from Daniel Sugarinsky. Can you say a few words about the concept of civic health and how it resonated with different publics? Daniel, if you want to add to that at all. And of course, this is important to me because I'm a member of an organization which runs a civic health index. So why don't you, Kristen, Mindy, what do you think?
Kristen, do you want to take that one? Yeah.
I can show my screen again and show you how it showed up in the data.
It was low.
Well, I mean, it was the highest. Actually, let me show this where I have too many things on my screen. Okay, let's see.
But it was one of those,
It
I
was
think.
not necessarily low. I think there's a couple of different stories here. The highest thing that it was neither positive nor negative. It was also, I mean, if you add neither positive nor negative and not familiar together, that's almost 2/3.
Yeah.
Already. So I might consider that this term is one that could fall in the open for branding category. There don't seem to be
Play offense.
strong,
Yeah.
it's offense. Thank you. And the way that Jonathan described it, like there's not a lot of strong, deeply held sentiments around this yet, which, you know, maybe for people that run civic health organizations that might start to feel a little bit like an ouchie, but might actually be a good thing because there's a lot of space to build familiarity, to build positive association. You can be more on offense than defense. So I think there's a deeper story here. Don't count civic health out, that's for sure.
Kristen Hansen from the Civic Health Project is now breathing a deep sigh of relief. So,
Absolutely. Mindy, did you want to jump in on anything on that?
You're muted, Mindy.
I think she said no.
Okay,
I was just saying, yeah, no,
Well,
Kristen covered it.
Well, thank you so much. This was a terrific conversation. Thank you for staying overtime for coffee and donuts. Again, we will be sending the recording, all the other materials, and other ways you can get involved in this project, making meaning of it, the data, the mini grants, eventually the civic language challenge and things like that. Also, please remember April 13th, next learning circle for NCoC, focused on how legislators are working more productively with their constituents, lessons from 80 countries. Thank you all. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you to all of us at NCoC and PACE and Civic Data for all of your help. See you all next time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.